To all who come to this happy podcast, welcome. Welcome to This Happy Place, a Disney podcast. And welcome to the series where I will be reviewing all 63 Disney animated films in chronological order. We are on number 2, which means the next movie up is Pinocchio. Pinocchio follows Pinocchio, a wooden puppet created by woodworker Geppetto who has always wanted a boy. With Jiminy Cricket at his side, the Blue Fairy promises Pinocchio that if he can prove himself truthful and unselfish, he could be turned into a real boy. However, Pinocchio is easily tempted and repeatedly ignores the warnings from Jiminy and ends up in places he probably shouldn't. Will Pinocchio learn his lesson? Pinocchio was Disney's second full-length animated feature film, and it premiered February 23, 1940. With the massive success of Snow White nearly 3 years before, Disney was riding an all-time high. So Pinocchio must have been a success too, right? I don't think you could call it a massive success, and you would probably find yourself stretching too much just trying to call it a success. Like pretty much all of Disney's early animated films, they came from an already established fairy tale. Pinocchio came from the story, The Adventures of Pinocchio, and forgive me if I mispronounce this author's name, by Carlo Collodi. It was well known, but it wasn't on the same level as Cinderella and other fairy tales written by the Brothers Grimm. It was the Disney movie that really put Pinocchio into the limelight. The book was described by an Italian philosopher as, quote, starting like a children's book, then betrays its readers with contradictions. The movie definitely follows that as well, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Disney wanted to make Bambi for her second feature. At this point, there were actually some work being done for Bambi, but the detailed animation was taking way too long. Bambi was in production before they ever started anything with Pinocchio, but they needed to put a movie out, and so Pinocchio got bumped and quickly rushed into production. Animation director Jack Kinney was quoted saying, "Crank it out was the word, so we did." Pinocchio was treated as something that just needed to get done, almost like a chore for Walt and the studio. There wasn't that same sense of love and care for it that Walt put into his other movies. At the same time Pinocchio was getting developed, Walt was more focused on making Fantasia, which would come out shortly after Pinocchio. One of the main factors that went into the troubled production of Pinocchio was the amount of creative overhauls the project had. In the first drafts of the movie, Pinocchio was more similar to how he was in the original story, a mischievous, imp-like boy who didn't have that same sense of innocence and ignorance to the world around him. They just couldn't find a good way to adapt him from a story to make him more friendly to the child audience. Commenting on the original story, Walt said, "People know the story, but don't like the character." They also found a similar challenge when trying to figure out how to include Jiminy Cricket into the movie. He was just a minor character at first with not a lot of screen time. The entire script was reworked numerous times, and any sense of original creative vision that was there at first was lost with each new script. Walt also really didn't have any oversight in Pinocchio's production, which just made the whole process feel a lot more disjointed, especially since all the animators were used to how the production of Snow White went. Different animators worked on isolated parts of the film, not really knowing what was going on with the parts they were not working on. This is typical for animation. You usually have animators working on specific parts, but it was more isolated on Pinocchio than other movies. Those animators who worked on Pinocchio and the ones who worked on Jiminy Cricket weren't really aware of how their pieces were going to fit together in the final movie. The animators at Disney were getting too confident with themselves, and understandably so. They were coming off a massive success, and they felt like they couldn't do any wrong. With that mentality, the budget of Pinocchio skyrocketed to being more than Snow White by roughly $800,000. But to give the animators credit, you can definitely see where the improvements are. The characters move with a lot more fluidity, they have a lot more expression, and the animation just looked better. Disney legend Ward Kimball said, "We are pretty cocky coming off Snow White. We thought we could just sit down and do another feature, so we plunged into it." When the movie finally came out, it was a disappointment financially. To use modern lingo, it bombed at the box office. For example, where Snow White made close to $2 million in England alone, Pinocchio only made $200,000. There were several reasons as to why it didn't do that well. First, the overall tone of the movie. We need to remember this movie came out in 1940. World War II had just started several months before, and the tone of Pinocchio isn't exactly what people may be wanting to see during a war. Snow White provided a fantastical relief for a world that was heading into depression and a possible war, while Pinocchio may have reminded people about the hardships of the war. Another reason why Pinocchio didn't do that well financially was the war itself. Snow White was able to be so successful because of its massive presence in the foreign market. However, with the war, a lot of foreign countries weren't allowing shipments of American films into them, so a huge potential market was cut off. And one of the final reasons was Gone with the Wind, a classic I'm sure many of you have heard of before. Gone with the Wind has a massive, massive success during this time. If you adjust it for inflation, Gone with the Wind is the highest grossing movie of all time, so that also took away potential box office from Pinocchio, granted that these two movies did go after different audiences. Despite the financial failures, Pinocchio is actually a massive success critically. Let's take a look at some of those reviews. I find some of these reviews on Rotten Tomatoes who actually have some reviews from the year the movie came out. This movie has a 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, so I couldn't find a negative one. But here's what some people had to say. The Hollywood Reporter. Since comparisons will be inevitable, it may as well be said at once that, from a technical standpoint, conception and production, this picture is infinitely superior to Snow White. Variety said, the picture stresses evil figures and results of wrongdoing more vividly and to greater extent than Snow White, and at times somewhat overplays these factors for children. The New Republic said, though here you will find the animated cartoon opening out into a wide and plunging motion it never had the range for till now. The unsurpassed design and synchronization of sound brings the cartoon to a level of perfection that the word cartoon will not cover again. Movies are experiential events. When you watch a movie, you want to feel something, happy or sometimes even sad. A big factor on deciding how you like a movie is remembering how you felt while watching it. There have been plenty of instances where I have said I don't remember that movie, but I remember feeling joy when watching it. I bring that up because Pinocchio is a tale of two movies for me. You have the first 25 minutes or so from the beginning of the movie up until Pinocchio when he gets conned into joining Stromboli and his marionette puppet circus. The first 25 minutes I would call Disney magic in the purest form. The movie opens up with Jiminy Cricket talking to the audience about the story we are about to watch. The music that plays over this has come to be Disney's theme song, When You Wish Upon a Star. I am still amazed with how many people don't know that the song they hear in front of every Disney movie, still to this day, is from Pinocchio. The song perfectly sums up what Disney is all about. When you wish upon a star, it makes no difference who you are. Anything your heart desires will come to you. One thing that is interesting about the beginning of the movie is the storybook that opens is animated. When you think about Snow White or even Sleeping Beauty, the book that opens to tell you a brief synopsis of the things that happened before the events of the movie is practical. I think it was a really fun idea to make the book in Pinocchio animated. It makes you feel more connected to the story right away. You are immediately drawn in. Jiminy Cricket is such a lovable character. He is one of my favorite Disney characters. It was such a smart choice by Walt to give him a bigger part than was originally planned. Once Jiminy gets into the shop, Geppetto's shop, we are instantly greeted with charm. Geppetto's shop is filled with cuckoo clocks that must have been a blast to come up with ideas and animate them. You instantly fall in love with Geppetto and get attached to the characters. Snow White used the multiplane camera, but Pinocchio perfected it. I agree with reviews of the time that say Pinocchio is animated better than Snow White. Everything is more crisp, vibrant, and colorful. The use of the multiplane camera is extremely impressive. For those of you who don't know, the multiplane camera is a camera invented by the Disney company to provide more depth into animated films. The camera, rather than filming sideways, is suspended in the air and filming downwards. Below it are multiple planes of glass, hence the name the multiplane camera. Each pane of glass has a different part of the scene painted on it. For example, one pane has the foreground, one has the middle ground, and one has the background. After you had it set up the way you wanted to, you could move each pane of glass closer or further from the camera to give the illusion of depth in what would otherwise be a two-dimensional scene. The foreground could move faster than the background, which would provide a sense of parallax. It was an innovative way to create a 3D effect in a 2D movie. You could also move the panes left to right, giving the illusion that the camera could pan just like in a live-action film. A great example of this multiplane camera is right at the beginning of the movie, when Jiminy is telling us how he discovered Geppetto's workshop. You see it from a distance, and then the pane with the shop gets closer to the camera, simulating Jiminy's hops, and the workshop gets bigger as you get closer. I did say this movie was a tale of two feelings. It turns from charming to, well, I'm not really sure how to describe it. It just felt weird, icky, and dirty. I'm still trying to decide how old my kid will need to be in order to show them Pinocchio. They may only know the first 20 minutes of the movie, since those first 20 minutes I would say are Disney magic in the most pure form. I can definitely relate to the audiences of 1940. I wouldn't want to watch this movie either in a time like they were experiencing. It gets very depressing very quickly, and once it does, it never really gets more cheery to the last minutes of the movie. Pleasure Island is such an icky place. I get that's what they were going for, but it just didn't make me feel very good. You have Tobacco Row, a place with the classic tobacco Indians handing out cigars to boys. You have the Rough House, where you are encouraged to punch someone in the face. And then you have Pinocchio and his buddy on the island Flitwick drinking pint after pint of beer. These are things that would definitely not make it into a kids' movie today, and would probably get the movie a PG or even a PG-13 rating for drug and alcohol use. This movie came out before the rating system we know it today, so when Pinocchio was revisited, it was rated G officially. But I bet if they ever revisited it, it would get that PG or PG-13 rating. Not to mention that all the boys on Pleasure Island are part of a child donkey trafficking ring, and it's just not very fun to watch. And when the time comes when Pinocchio and Geppetto are reunited in the whale and taken back home, and Pinocchio turns into a real boy, I don't feel any gratification for the story we just watched. You should feel the same as you did watching the beginning of the movie, but you just don't. Since you don't have a fun time watching it, it makes the movie drag on and on and on. The story doesn't flow very well. You can definitely tell that Walt didn't have as much oversight on this movie, and the production was disjointed. It hurts, and it felt like I was watching the last 5 minutes of the movie on repeat, just because it was so clunky. Overall, I can acknowledge that this movie did make significant technical achievements that are impressive. It also has a captivating main song and a fun score. But what happens in Pleasure Island, I just can't get past it. There were very fun animated sequences to watch. It was just dampened by the dark, uneasy turn of the movie. Pinocchio enters the list at number 2 on my ranking of Disney animated movies, but remember, there are only 2 movies on the list so far. Well, that was Pinocchio. Make sure you go check out the first episode in this series of Snow White, and kind of the prequel to this series where I talk about the different eras of Disney animation. Thank you for listening to this Happy Place, a Disney podcast. And remember, there is a great big beautiful tomorrow shining at the end of every day.